the third Ikar has to do with the belief in an anthropomorphic God. Harambam talks about the Yesod HaShlishi, Shlilat HaGashmut Mimenu. We have to remove any physicality from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There is, to understand there's zero physicality with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Harambam says many times, although we don't understand and we cannot describe what God is, we describe many places what he isn't. And here is an isn't, is that he is not physical, that he has no physicality whatsoever. And we'll talk about what that actually means. V'hu, shezeh had eno guf, v'lo koach shel guf. He's not a body and not a bodily force, right? A force that actually comes from a guf. V'lo yir'ehu me'orot hagufot. And what we call accidents or happenings that come to a body will not come to him. Lo yir'uhu me'orot hagufot kimo hatnu'a v'mnuha. Motion and rest, these imply movements of a body. And if God is not a body, therefore there are no movements, there are no points of rest, no happenings that happen to a body. Lo be'etzem ve'lo be'mikre. These are two philosophical terms, which we will not fully describe at this moment, which he describes in the Moreh in great detail. Etzem and mikre. Etzem is the from the actual essence of the item itself, and mikre are things that happen onto the item. Okay. Okay, yeah. Ufichach shalalu mimenu alehem hashalom hibur v'pirud. Similarly, we cannot talk about God in parts, meaning not separation and not unification. Those are two things that cannot apply to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Va'amru lo yeshiva v'lo amida, no sitting, no standing, lo oref v'lo ipui. Ritzonam lomar lo pirud v'u oref. What's oref? Separation. V'lo hibur. Lefi she'ipui me'omro ve'afu b'katef pilishtim. Klomar yithafum b'katef. Lithabiram bahim. Right? Push them together so that they would become united amongst them. Ve'amar Navi. Ve'el mi tedamyun el. Who can you compare God to? Ve'el mi tedamyuni ve'eshveh. And who will you compare me to that I will equal? Ve'ilu hayaguf. If God was bodily, we could simply answer that question. What are you talking about? He's similar to the body. Anything that comes in the Kitvei HaKodesh, in the Tanakh, which seems to describe God as you would describe a body, all of these movements, standing, sitting, talking, right, which happens often. Hakol derech hash'ala. Rambam defines these as a borrowed term. U'kamo she'amru dibra Torah kilshon bnei adam. The Torah spoke in words of human words. Ukvar dibru anashim b'zeh inyan harbe. Many have spoke about it. B'zeh yesod hashlishi shemoreh alav ki lo ri'item kol tmuna. You have not seen any tmuna. R'tzono lomar lo isagtem oto ba'al tmuna. But you have not understood him or comprehended him through as a vision. He's not a goof and not koach goof. It's important to understand this. I'll elaborate a little bit more. Harambam talked about derech hash'ala. Harambam spends a good probably 20 to 25% of the Moreh most of it in Helek Aleph, at least about half of Helek Aleph, going through these terms one at a time, Perek by Perek, and explaining what the anthropomorphic terms really mean. And he uses what we called Shemot Mush'alim, borrowed terms, that they mean one thing, and when we use them like HaKadosh Baruch Hu, about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they are borrowed in a different meaning. He talks also about equivocal terms, right? That actually terms that are not borrowed but have more than one meaning. And these actually, this is not to understand it metaphorically. This is saying that the term means something else when it's talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and as when it's talking about something physical. And actually, it could have more than one meaning even when in physical terms. But the meaning that is used by HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the meaning that doesn't imply physicality and anthropomorphism. Again, that is not to say that he's explaining it metaphorically. Sometimes he will do that. Say, this is what the term means, but we need to understand it in a more metaphorical sense. All of these is what Harambam does in great detail in the Moreh in the beginning. He just seems to hint at it over here. And the terms are used so that we should understand something about the uniqueness and the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so therefore, because we only understand physicality, God is then brought to us in terms of physicality, so we should understand that. However, if you understand it literally, En lecha helek le'olam haba, and there's something unique about the way Harambam puts this, it makes no difference if you intentionally give him physicality or unintentionally. Maybe a person was taught about God in physical terms, and that's how he relates to him. It doesn't make a difference. En lo helek le'olam haba. I think they quote in the name of, I think it's Chaim, they say, a nebecha apikoros is still an apikoros. That a person who accidentally believes this, because this is how he was taught it still doesn't exonerate him. One must understand God in purely non-physical terms. And that's also very important. I'd like to explain a little bit further about that. Just as we understand, according to Rambam, just as we understand that God does not have bowels, for example, or bowel movements, or eating, or drinking, or moving, or literally speaking in the sense that man speaks, or is limited to a place, or bodily parts or functions. It is also, according to Rambam, equally important to understand God in terms of being not affected by human actions, in terms of emotional responses. And that is something it's important to understand. And therefore, man cannot cause change in God, so he can't get him angry, or he can't make him happy, or he can't, all of that as well, all of the emotional change that is mentioned l'gabei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, lefi da'at Harambam, is also b'shemot hash'ala. There's no change in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There is no literal anger. Harambam explains, when we say God got angry, it means he acted in a way that would show in human beings the way they would perform and act while they're angry. But we cannot imply any emotional response because that's part of the physicality. Now, this Ikar is the first Ikar where Harambam actually fought for. Right, the first two Ikarim that we mentioned, they were any person in the Jewish world would believe that. However, Harambam at least describes that there were some even ancient Hachamim who believed in an anthropomorphic God. We know this from the writing, interestingly enough, of the Ra'avad. The Ra'avad in Ilchot Shuvah, where Harambam is describing that anyone who believes that God has a body is a mean, and he describes him as one of the character traits of a mean. The Ra'avad jumps in and he says something very interesting. Basically, he says, look, I agree with you, Harambam, that we shouldn't have anthropomorphic beliefs in God. But why'd you call them a meme? Because there are great people, great rabbis, better than you, who believe this, he tells Rambam. Right? Gedolim v'tovim mimenu, greater than you, greater than Rambam, who believe in this, which is a shocking statement. But that's what he says. And he says, you know what? You can't blame them. Because they follow the simple readings of some psukim and the agadot. And he says those simple readings of agadot are mishabesh tadat. They cause a person to err. Now this is the Avad who's saying you shouldn't take these literally. And therefore, they can't be blamed. We learn from this statement of the Avad two interesting things. One, that there were people in the medieval world, at least, and even great people that may have disagreed with Rambam on the Ikar. And second, second thing, that it seems, at least from the way that Avad understood Rambam, that even a person with good intentions who was misled, quote unquote, according to that Avad, by simplistic readings of texts, even rabbinic texts, that person, if he formulates his opinion, still ain't no Helek al. And that is where the Avad disagrees. And that Avad disagrees with him, and he says, no, you cannot write this guy off. Miskin. Right? He didn't really do it on purpose. He was just misled. And what do you want from him? But that is a debate between the Rambam and the Avad. And if we're trying to elucidate what the Rambam's opinion is, it becomes clear. The fourth Ikar is Yisod Rivi HaKadmut. That God is Shezeh Hadam Tuarhu Kadmon Behlet. That God precedes all creation. There is nothing that actually is Kadmon or ancient like God. God is Kadmon. Everything else follows him. There is nothing that is what we call eternal. God is eternal, and nothing else is eternal at all. Everything is created. Here he takes great task, and he does this in the second Helek of Moreh Nevuchim, with the Aristotelian and the Platonic belief of either the eternity of matter or the eternity of the universe. There is a difference between Plato and Aristotle. Plato believed in the eternity of matter, that there was a eternal matter, a Homed Kadmon, and from that God created the universe. And Aristotle actually believed in the eternal universe itself, that existence as we know it is eternal. Rambam rejects both of these in this fourth Ikar. Many people misread Rambam, what he wrote in the Moreh, that he seemed to have be willing to entertain the Plato's idea and not necessarily Aristotle's idea. What Rambam is simply saying at those points is that we cannot prove using the scientific principles that he had at his time them wrong. Therefore, but we can't prove them right either. In fact, although we can't conclusively prove them wrong, what he believed is that proofs lean heavier towards the Torah belief on creation rather than eternity. But he then says that even though I can't prove it, my belief in Kadmut, my approach to Kadmut Hashem and Hidush HaOlam, which is the creation of the world and not its eternity, come from my beliefs, but not necessarily my ability to prove the point using the scientific principles at his time. Parenthetically, and therefore he fought harshly against the Aristotelian belief in Kadmut HaOlam, in eternity, and he fought so harshly that he dedicated so much of the second part, the beginning of the second Helek of Moreh Nevuchim, to really go after Aristotle and his students, and he dealt with some of the very difficult questions that they posed to creation. Namely, if God decided to create, doesn't that imply change? And he really goes in great depth in the second Helek of the Moreh Nevuchim. History has an interesting way here of pointing this one out, that today, what we know scientifically in a post-Einstein world, there is nobody today who ascribes to the eternity of the universe, right? Everyone believes in a beginning and a moment of time. This is scientifically unquestioned anymore, right? The debate between scientists and Jews is sometimes which is called the age of the universe, how old the universe is, and this is always a debate. But the idea of the eternity of matter or the eternity of the universe has been totally discredited. And while Harambam was dealing with what was at that point the main scientific approach based on Aristotle and Plato, and he was debunking it from his belief and his religious perspective from the Torah, today we even can strengthen Rambam's attack on Aristotle by saying that all science has discredited the Aristotelian approach and has really, what Rambam thought was fighting science was today really giving him scientific backing as well as his religious backing. So this is, everything is bilti kadmon. Varayot lazeh bektuvim rabot, brings proofs from many psukim. Zeu yesod harvi'i, hu shemoreh alav ma'amar me'ona Elohe kedem. God, right, is the dwelling place of the world, right? V'da כי היסוד היותר גדול של תורת משה רבנו הוא היות העולם מחודש. This is the great yesod, the greatest yesod of the Torah of Moshe, that the world is created. המציאו השם ובראו אחר היעדר הגמור. He created the world after absolute nothingness. וזה שתראני סובב סביב עניין קדמותו על דעת הפילוסופים הוא כדי שיהיה מופיע על יציאותו יתעלה מוחלט כמו שביארתי וביררתי במורה. Now, this is a question that he's addressing here. If you open up the beginning of the Helek Bet of the Moreh, where God proves, or attempts to, where Harambam proves the existence of God, and he uses the idea, he proves it based on the eternal matter and eternal universe. So he's using an argument that he doesn't believe to prove the existence of God. So he's addressing that you see me doing this. Taking the philosophical approach, I want to do this to prove God's existence even based on the philosophical approach of Kadmut HaOlam. Meaning, if you have creation, then obviously you don't need to prove the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's easy, because as Rav Saadia Gaon and many say, every created item needs a creator. And so therefore, the approach of Rasak, for example, would be to invest everything in the proof of creation, and then the proof of the existence of the deity and the creator is obvious. Harambam does not take that approach. Harambam says creation and kadmut, although I believe it, is not perfectly provable, as I mentioned earlier, in those days. So therefore he wants to say, I want to prove the existence of God using the idea of kadmut ha'olam. And that's what he does. Not to say that he believes in kadmut ha'olam, but to show that even al pi kadmut ha'olam, he could prove the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And of course, if there's B'ri'ah, he could prove it. He mentions at the end of this Ikar that Kemo shebi'arti uberarti b'moreh, when he talks about his analysis and his battle with Aristotle and his proofs of Kadmut HaOlam, based on his proofs of Metziut HaBoreh based on Kadmut HaOlam, even though he disagrees with Kadmut HaOlam, he says he did this in the Moreh. So this is very important, because it also knocks out the belief that Harambam only wrote the Yud Gimel Ikarim in his youth, and when he wrote the Moreh, he had already graduated out of that, Chas v'Shalom. Because clearly, at this point in the Ikarim, he's quoting what he wrote in the Moreh. So the Moreh and the second Helek of the Moreh was already completed by the time he's actually dealing with this Ikar. So it shows that the Ikar was a mainstay at the end of his life as well, not something just he thought in his youth, and it is not something that he just wrote for the masses, because he is engaging the audience of the readers of the Moreh Nebuchim, and quite a complex part of the Moreh Nebuchim, Helek Bet, not just a simple part, and those people that are reading this are referred to analyze and to further continue in the Moreh. There is no contradiction. The Moreh and the Ikarim merge together and are one. The belief in the Ikarim is consistent with the reader of the Moreh and Nebuchim. And he does, and as I mentioned, mention or hint to the Ikarim at different points in the Moreh.